But first, please welcome our chair, Dr. Paul Ring, and our panelists, Simone Ferracina, Oliver Jones, and Tara Gbolade.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and welcome everyone. My name's Paul Ring. I'm the head of subject for architecture at Northumbria University, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Tara Gbolade and Simone Ferracina. I'm about to do a little bit of an introduction to myself, and then I'll ask the panel members to do an introduction of themselves, and then we'll get started with the discussion. So afternoon, everyone. I hope it's been a very useful day. I know there's been a number of excellent talks, and hopefully this and then the keynote later follow on in that experience for you. I'm an educator myself. I've been an educator for certainly Northumbria University for 17 years. As I said, I'm head of subject for architecture of a portfolio that includes BA and MArch architecture and BA interior architecture. That's my actual background, and I think that's why this is an interesting conversation to chair about next practice in terms of my background experience in interiors and adaptive reuse. I studied interiors at Glasgow and at Manchester Met, either side of some practice, and I am the author of the interior architecture programmes here at Northumbria. My research interests are about how we deal with adaptive reuse of extant buildings, particularly thinking about heritage or redundant material culture and how adaptive reuse could be a replacement for the kind of redundancy of permanence placed on monument. So that's my kind of overall approach, which, be it sort of theoretic in some ways, is also enshrouded in this notion that reusing something is in principle a sustainable act. So I'm delighted to chair this discussion today. If I can pass over to the two panel members to introduce themselves, first Simone and then Tara.
Hello everyone, thank you for having me. So I am Simone Ferracina. I'm the director of an experimental research practice called Exaptive Design Office, and a lecturer in architectural design and detail at the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, ISALA, at the University of Edinburgh. My work, articulated through writing, research, and teaching, investigates the technical infrastructures, theories, and methodological approaches required to move architectural discourse and practice beyond extraction, ecocide, and environmental injustice, and to challenge narrow disciplinary understandings of authorship, habitation, use, and value. I'm interested in the conceptualization, production, and circulation of building materials, particularly with a focus on reuse and repurposing.
Good afternoon, all. Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I am Tara Gbolade. I am an architect and passive house designer. I am a co-director for practice based in London, Gbolade Design Studio, where we focus on public and private sector projects. We really focus on a lot of residential developments and community projects, master plans, strategic visioning of new towns or urban extensions to cities or towns. Fundamentally, we focus on environmental, social, and economic growth and development of development, whether that be existing or new. I am also a mayor's design advocate, where I focus on the future neighborhoods 2030, working with local authorities, specifically in London, about their sustainability goals and what that might mean for particular neighborhoods. And finally, I sit on the steering group of Architects Declare, and I am a co-founder of the Paradigm Network, which champions Black and Asian representation within the built environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara and Simone, for your introduction. Some really interesting sort of backgrounds that you have for this discussion, particularly if I remove myself from the academic bias. We've got both spheres of the kind of the world of architecture here at the academy and then the practice. So that's a kind of really interesting panel to look at this sort of topic of next practice. Thinking about next practice, I mean, that could be what we think practice should look like, but it could also be about how we think we should behave as a practice as well. So I'm kind of interested in the session to how we can look at those two aspects of the title Next Practice. And you've selected an image that you want to talk at for a few minutes about that. If we could start with yourself, Simone, if we can look at that image and hear your presentation.
Yes, fantastic. So I'll wait for the image to come onto the screen. But I will start. So again, thank you for having me at this event. Are you able to see the image?
Yes.
Okay, there it is. Perfect. Because I'm referring to it. So the black and white images on the screen are fragments of student work. A student dismantling pallets. The architectures made with inverted milk cartons by Andrew Wyness, Kaya Hayes, and Alana Cummings. A chair made with discarded hangers by Talula Bannerman, Eli Duffy, and Molly Deasley, and plastic corks turned into modular units of construction by Ryan Liu, Ivy Yang, and Tenny Zhang. I chose to put them up on the screen because they exemplify key trends or changes in how architectural design is approached. They're made with discarded secondary or low-value materials. These materials were harvested locally by negotiating with and relying on the generosity of local communities and enterprises. Their configuration depends on the availability and properties of local materials and turns them into opportunities for creativity rather than limits. And all these designs are modular and capable of being assembled, disassembled, and reconfigured in time. The image in pale green is instead a fragment of the cover of my recent book, Ecologies of Inception, Design Potentials on a Warming Planet, published by Routledge, which alongside the images inspires the following prompts or provocations. So prompt 1, understand design as fundamentally relational. The notion of ecology of inception I develop in the book is precisely a way to avoid speaking of objects in isolation or trusting the narrow definitions we use to describe them. For example, believing that a pencil can draw regardless of context, and to instead shift our attention to the wider ecologies that make possible certain actions or uses. Drawing is requiring not only a pencil, but at least also a piece of paper and a human hand. And more importantly, relying not on any particular item the pencil can draw, but on their ability to communicate and co-function and function together. This allows for a certain distance to be detected between what something is and what something is for, or what it was designed to do. And this distance is, I believe, one of the creative frontiers of a post-carbon future. Prompt 2, understand design and the designation of value to be always political. The notion of ecology of inception identifies how constellations of objects are modified to be able to interact with one another, contiguously or at a distance, and to unlock emergent potentials. For instance, the components in a bike, which together make it possible for me to ride it. But co-functioning protocols also delineate boundaries of value, of care, of attention that exclude other objects or bodies, and that have the ability to make them invisible or worthless, to construct their disposability. To design in the 21st century also means then to challenge these ecologies' tenuous hold on the attribution of purity or worthiness, and to choreograph new ecologies of use and value around that which already exists. Prompt 3, challenge a view of design that is predicated upon outputs or projects and designers or brands, upon authorship, conceptual integrity, and art historical baselines, and focus instead on embodiment. Not in the sense of a translation of ideas and intentions into physical outputs, which tends to rely on raw materials, harmful extractive processes, and environmental injustices, but as a way to take seriously the fact that existing objects are the physical results and representations of CO2 emissions, of environmental damage, and of the expenditure of energy, resources, and labor. And this alone justifies their preservation and continued circulation and revaluing. And the fourth prompt is that in this scenario of radical preservation and recirculation, notions of designer and manufacturer responsibility will need not only to extend in time and to account for the actual or declared effects of a product's primary or intended use, but also to address the broader spectrum of its misuses and environmental dispositions. So what the object is bound to do if certain conditions arise, particularly as these become increasingly unpredictable. One might think of the extreme temperatures we experienced in the UK over the summer. And finally, be suspicious of design solutions, which can be smokescreens for business as usual. So while my work revolves around notions of maintenance, repair, care, and reuse, sorry, my voice is doing something strange, and repurposing, even these approaches can perpetuate forms of material violence and injustice, and will not be effective unless supported by more radical changes in how we live, and by policies aimed directly at reducing throughput and at capping the extraction and primary production of many commonly used but environmentally nefarious materials. Thank you. And apologies for my voice.
That's fine. It was clear. There was no real kind of loss in clarity from that momentary lapse. It was really interesting. I mean, what I'd like to do is to go through both discussions first and then try and bring them together. But just as a really quick observation, given that I just talked myself about reuse of things that are considered to be of high value, buildings and monuments and heritage, I found that really interesting about this kind of redundant or low value object as a sort of moment of significance as well. So I'd really like to come back to that. That was really interesting. If we could then if Tara, if you could talk to your slide, and then we'll just try and stitch the stories together.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess while my slide is coming up, I'll just start because I've got, I think, probably about 4 points I wanted to make, and just building off and thank you so much, Simone, for your talk. It was fantastic. But building off the thought of, certainly from our own work, what are the new or emerging attitudes that we're certainly finding that we're needing to adopt, is first of all a general point, which is that challenges and opportunities that seem to exist and aren't going away and are embedded now in design, in what we're finding, is that they're far more varied and they're far more complex than I think ever before, just because of the way we're moving in society. There's a layering of themes and topics that I think we're looking at in architecture and urban design, from design to sustainable design, health and well-being, to socioeconomic influences, and future gazing to wider issues. Also, work today feels really expansive, and so therefore that means, I think, particularly with 75% of practices being SME practices, working on really varied scales, from single homes, albeit with varying budgets to that, through to master plans and through to strategic visioning work. And we're certainly finding that in our work, and that's both across public and private sectors. But fundamentally, with all of these flux, or with all this flux, we're fundamentally creating places for people, and creating this to the highest quality is the crux of the matter. So 3 key points I'd like to expand upon. First is industry upskilling, particularly as we've all now become conversant to a degree of our climate emergency, or at least accepting of it, our climate emergency. But now it's that movement towards definitions, net zero, the retrofit challenge. What does that actually mean in practice for us, for existing buildings that we already have, for existing places we already have? So there's a wide industry-wide upskilling that's occurring rapidly, both in professional education, so architects, urban designers, and wider, but through to contractors on site, through to Simona spoke about DFMA and design for manufacturing assembly and MMC, and these are coming through rapidly at the moment. The image that's on screen just starts to look at a particular project we're working on in Crystal Palace, which is being designed and on site to the RIBA 2030 climate challenge. So really focusing on operational energy and embodied carbon. I specifically chosen this project because it's for private clients, and where previously there's a view that developers and private clients might not want the highest quality. Now there's a language that really comes through in really investing in the type of quality of developments that they're looking at, particularly also with the fact that there's a market advantage to having higher quality buildings, because us as a society are demanding more from our clothes, from what we eat, and from where we live, from the places in which we stay. The second point is that we're seeing a lot of is regenerative development. Here we're looking at what is the net positive impact of our decision making that goes beyond our immediate selves. Who are the people, places, organizations that exist in a place, and how can we work to preserve and enhance them, to preserve and enhance existing connections? What is the potential of a place, of a people, of an organization? And specifically using tools like Systems Map in order to hold and explore ideas, which gives us an opportunity to connect both visible and invisible links. And specifically here, an example is we're working on a master plan, which is in effect an urban extension. Here we're looking at existing socioeconomic infrastructure and strengthening these. So whether that looks at the existing production industry in a particular place, like blacksmithing, through to graphic design and railway part repairs, and looking at co-location on sites. We're exploring undergrounding high voltage cables as a way of extending developable areas so that these spaces can be used as local farms and then serve farm-to-table restaurants, supporting the local food industry that already exists, and then extending arts and sculpture scenes from an existing town center, but through into the edges of a new place. So the concluding point for that particular aspect is this idea of radical regeneration and moving well beyond sustainability now, because we really can't afford to do anything else. And then the last point I'll make is about collaboration over competition, and or more specifically, collaboration as a competitive advantage. What we're finding today is that we can't really afford, with the largest projects coming on in society today, new garden towns, new urban extensions, we really can't afford not to collaborate, particularly the idea of bringing different voices round the table. And this goes well beyond just stakeholder and community collaboration, but ensuring that the one who holds the pen reflects the diversity of the place that is being designed to. So, and I think this is really interesting because what we're finding is that a lot of larger practices are collaborating with smaller practices as well, who might have a different risk appetite. So therefore, perhaps pushing wider and wilder ideas than a more understandably bigger risk averse companies might be able to do, and having that create a new type of innovation in developments and master plans. And an example of this is design coding, and specifically we worked with a larger practice on the National Model Design Code with Southern Council, where we were able to bring, as a practice, local area knowledge and play on our expertise of sustainable design. So I think in conclusion to all of that, I think there's a radical generosity that might be able to come through in the next wave of how we develop places. Thanks.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Simone. Two really interesting challenges and provocations towards the title, but also interesting in how you're looking at the same territory or landscape from different definitions, you know, one which is, you know, and I hate to just immediately try and generalize the conversation, but one looking at, you know, action and participatory, real-time, everyday object scale or theoretic practice, which is about an ideology, and one which is, Tara, you're dealing with the kind of sustainability of people, place, community, and future conditions, if you like, which are, whilst both incredibly kind of pertinent, demonstrate the sheer shift in scale of this kind of climate literacy, climate response, that it's not in singular acts, it's kind of omnipresent and it's transmittable. I mean, something that if I can interpret something you both said, I mean, I thought it was really interesting that on one hand, Simone was saying, be suspicious of design solutions. And Tara, you were saying, these kind of definitions that industry attaches to this problem as supposed design solutions, you're even yourself saying, well, what do they mean? What are they? So I wonder if that's something worth discussing, because you're perhaps talking about the same thing from a different gaze, I open that to both of you. Sorry.
Yeah, I think certainly from this perspective, over the last couple of years, we've seen such varying ambitions and new performance targets come out, whether that be related to building or whether that be related to wider urban design, urban plan. And as an industry, trying to decide, well, particularly when we have, say, building regulations, which is of course the bottom of the pile at the moment, what are we working towards? A lot of us in industry attach ourselves to the UK GBC definitions, which I won't reel off now because it's quite well worded and I don't have it in front of me, but we attach ourselves to the UK GBC definitions for, say, net zero. But this continues to change, this continues to adapt as we become wiser and smarter. I gave an example with the image I had of the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge. And just in the last couple of years, when that first came out, version 1 had embodied carbon, like for development per square meter, embodied carbon targets of, say, 300 for the embodied carbon, and that changed to 625 within the space of a year. So the industry is going through this rapid change at the moment and rapid understanding of what it means for sustainable design, for sustainable development. And I think it's easy to use sustainability as a blanket. It's easy, as we've heard, to try and cloak everything under greenwashing, but fundamentally we're not doing ourselves any favors. So it really is critical for us to get to grips with what that means. And I do believe that it's important that we understand what that means for us, ourselves, our practice, and allowing that to translate itself authentically in our work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Simone, you look like you're going to respond.
Yeah. So I said that provocatively because I spend my time talking about or thinking about reuse, and then even when we're working with students and try to reuse certain materials, we run into things like risk assessments. And all of a sudden you realize that you're working or you're looking at something that potentially is toxic, and you might be perpetuating that violence through reuse. So sometimes it's really useful to complicate and kind of step back and complicate these definitions. I think Tara's absolutely right. The way we talk about things is so incredibly important, and try to remember what they mean and try to see whether they have strayed from what we thought they were. And one example for me is the circular economy, which partially I would say I subscribe to, and it's very easy to say it's what everyone should do. But then there are elements of it where you start thinking, okay, if we're thinking about the circulation, the eternal circulation of molecules across systems, what that should normally do is stop the need or seriously curb the need for primary materials. But when that doesn't happen, or even stepping back, you might think, but are there better ways, instead of going through this loop, to actually directly stop or curb the production of materials like plastic, like aluminum, which we know are incredibly devastating environmentally? Do we have to invent this other loop that makes us look at how good we are when we recycle a plastic bottle or a glass bottle? Or are we able to differentiate between things that are absolutely needed, like reuse, like designing with the right kinds of materials and everything else, but then what systemically needs to happen, maybe in policy, in another direction, and how the two need to collaborate? It's easy to put everything under one giant category, and that doesn't help us typically.
Yeah, sorry, Tara, did you want to reply there?
Yeah, no, I just think that, as Simona was speaking, I think it's such an important point this even just circular economy. I think it's such an important work, obviously, that you do, because this side on practice, or in practice, it's about taking the material and the work that you've done and the research that you've done and applying it quickly to building. And I know that certainly within our projects, we're always looking to push boundaries. So, for example, with projects where we're exploring the use of K-brick, which is very much about construction and demolition, waste being recycled and recompressed. And so therefore the embodied carbon used in this brickwork is less than 1/10 of what we normally use in brickwork. But this is a very traditional material, but innovation coming in a new way and allowing us to use that in a new way. And so it's really that link between the critical research work that happens that allows us to work in a different way with the clients and with the people that we get to work with on the ground as well. So that was the point I wanted to make.
Because there's a discussion there about the role of legislation, isn't there? And big legislation or small legislation, but there is a discussion there about it. There are practices like super use studio in Holland, for example, and harvest mapping, where there's an intent to apply a manifesto of never purchase unless it's absolutely mandatory, reuse, or use a harvest map to reuse from deconstructed opposed to demolished sites. But with retrofit in the UK from the championing from the AJ as a notion or an ideal, and with harvest maps as ideals, they simply aren't legislated. What's your views on the role government legislation has on making this more than just design guide and perhaps more of a kind of mandatory act for practice?
I'm happy to jump in here to start. I think this is a really it's such an important question, and I think what we're finding is happening is that we can't afford to wait for government, and in legislation we need always carrots and sticks. And with some of the work that I certainly did with the Harlow and Gilson Garden Town, that very much looked at this opportunity of carrots and sticks. How do we encourage development for best practice that we know is achievable now, but actually what is the baseline that we will not allow any new development to go below? And what are the consequences of not going below? And in this instance, it very much was about the powers around planning, specifically, for example, and how easy or not one would go through the planning process. But I do think that this dichotomy of carrots and sticks is really important. With legislation, we continue to lobby. We can't afford not to. But in industry, with groups like Gbolade, with Architects Declare, UK GBC, we must continue to lobby government to change legislation, because again, we already know what's possible and we have the solutions now. We're not talking about something in the distant future. This is what we have available to us now, which I think goes to the other side of the carrots. A lot of practices I know have declared a climate emergency. We certainly have within our practice, which means by default, we will not build to any standards that are less than RIBA 2030 or Architects Declare goals. Each project obviously is unique, and so will have its own framework to work within. But as a practice, we've decided that this is our baseline because we can't afford to wait for government policy, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bold and admirable position to hold, isn't it? In the face of, commercial viability, and it's, but that's what we need. We need a demonstration to clients and developers and communities that it is possible, and it can be small and medium acts as well as large acts, like you described. And Simone, you're in academia, if you like. You're manufacturing the next agents of this, aren't you? So, Tara's trying to do it from within the system. Yeah, you and I are helping the next agents of change sort of go into industry. I mean, how do you find that discussion about legislation and the role of empowerment there?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I think for me as an educator, the key point is to remind students that that's something they have to pay attention to, and keep pressing on. But I agree that we see practices that push the boundaries, and those practices really can lead the way, and it's fantastic to see. And in terms of reuse, for example, I'm thinking of legislation also at a different scale, say the scale of the specification, where all of a sudden trying to specify a material, or say a structural element that's reused, becomes incredibly difficult in terms of certifications and testing and everything else. In some cases, you might want to specify something you don't have. You might want to specify a window, which is going to be a reclaimed window, which will be available when that project is under construction in 2 years. So there are all these different questions about how to deal with systems that are currently in place also, and how to navigate them through these new needs and requirements and aspirations that we have as a society, which I think are very difficult, but I would kind of also be relatively optimistic. I think they're incredibly exciting. And, for architects or for students who are studying architecture today, to realize that there really is, it's an ugly word, but there is a frontier of things to be discovered, understood, and kind of worked out, is, I think, really exciting. So that's part of the answer. I mean, the other answer for me is about the culture and about what we value. For instance, in school, we find very difficult, we're working through ways of introducing retrofitting, for example, as something that can be done in the studio, because we're so used to seeing really flashy designs and to associate value to the more you build and to the more formally interesting something is. Then once you start doing projects where they're much more subtle in their intervention, and they try to do the least possible, that goes against most of our natural biases that tell us what something good is in design. And so that's, I think, the other key problem that I try to address. How do we change the culture from an educational perspective so that we become able to see value where we might not now?
Yeah, and the exercise that you've showed in the image that you take the students through in Edinburgh is a byproduct of that notion of value in the everyday, is a byproduct of that, the start of a learning about beauty and consequence or something, that rather than, as you've described, the predictability of the edifice, is that also part of your story, or is it a consequence?
Yeah, I think part of it is particularly thinking about materials as not something that you buy on Amazon. It's not something you click on your keyboard and it appears. But in that case, yes, there are secondary or discarded materials, and of course the idea of the studio is to activate them through design. But there's also a real question of understanding that materials are associated with real sites, real people, real labor, sweat. Students have to potentially clean those materials. So they begin to think of things like maintenance as not something, the designers are here and whoever maintains buildings are here, and there's really this incredible hierarchy. But as part of the same ethos, so both kind of searching for materials, both cleaning them, both kind of repairing them, all of these processes as being, and particularly being in contact with all the people that allow for that harvest to happen, is really important, and kind of removes all the abstractions that tend to be in kind of embedded in our profession, and as a way to not let us see and think about things like labor, or where a material comes from, or kind of conditions it was produced in, and so on.
Yeah, and Tara, just thinking about that, I mean, there was an aspect of some of your work which was about community and co-design, and in some way that kind of so we're talking about grassroots and appreciation of materiality, the found object, and in some ways the found condition that is the community, the people that a space is for. There's great kind of like sustainability and just that act of with the people it's for, and the kind of richness that sustainability as an attitude brings to that. I mean, you've got examples of that in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving from large scale, just building on what Simone was speaking about, and in that question of the people we design for, I'll use a very small example, which is retrofitting of existing buildings and retrofitting of a couple's home who are slightly older, and they're living in a home that was built in the mid 1800s. So it's cold and it's drafty, and and they need to be co-creators. Basically, there's no point an architect designer coming in, doing what they need to, walking out. But there's a real education piece that the designer goes on, that the owners of the building go on, so that at the end of the delivery of a project, of say a retrofitting, say a listed home, it's something they're able to understand and use better. And that's because understanding, say, existing buildings, which are, say, listed, they have a breathability built into them. They have a mechanics of the way they work. So you're working with solid construction from the 1840s, which in the UK has been extended, say, in the 1960s. So you now have cavity walls that are uninsulated, and then extended again in the 2000s, which now means you have cavity walls that are insulated. And you're working with all these types of construction methodologies. And you have to understand that building. You have to intricately understand what the needs are of these different parts of a single building require. And then as a designer, you're constantly thinking, well, we're thinking about sustainable design, and we want low embodied carbon products. We want to use, say, wood fiber to allow this building to continue to breathe. And you're clashing against the fact that it's a heritage building, and you've got features like cornices and single glazed windows that planning departments will have a strop if you remove. So there are all these different complex, intimate decisions that go in just retrofitting a building because of the stock we have. And it is beautiful, and it's such an exciting process to be able to understand a building with a client, with a co-creator, because they go on this journey of understanding how their building works as well, and therefore how to use it. And actually, could solutions be as simple as actually reinstating the existing shutters, which means that the fabric becomes immediately more energy efficient, rather than, say, insulating. And understanding, well, do we actually use our chimney? Do we want to use our chimney? What does the future look like? So they become co-creators in this process, and that, imagine, is multiplied over when you're talking about a 10 unit development, when you're talking about a master plan development, understanding the people being co-collaborators and co-communicators in what is being developed.
I mean, that's such an interesting point, and hopefully there are students out there in the audience, the next sort of generation of designers, because converging those two notions, I really quite like a picture of a kind of socially conscious, collaborative agent of subtlety you know, because in some ways that's what we're trying to promote, that architecture can be beautiful when it's subtle and helpful. It doesn't have to be, you know, it doesn't have to be in the front page of a magazine in a predictable sense, you know. And that's you know, we're kind of running out of time a little bit because I need to make some space for questions. And so you know, as an invite to the audience, if there are any questions that you'd like to pose to Tara and Simeone, to type them in the chat, and I can moderate those. So whilst people might be posing some questions, just on that general title, the notion of next practice, if there's a way of summarising from the two spheres, you know, what does our architectural practices look like next, or what do they need to be like? And then after Simone, what's the next generation of architects, and what's the role of academia now to make the next architects the right architects? There's two really easy questions for you.
So was that okay? It was to start with me. Apologies. I think, yeah, easy question indeed. So I think that, you know, what does architecture look like and what does next practice look like? I do think we have to be optimistic. We have to be radically regenerative in the way we think. We can't think in silos. We have to get over this idea of shiny, glossy, we've said it already, of shiny, glossy architecture, and recognize appreciation in what exists, and recognize appreciation in the small but really impactful decisions that we're making, and be satisfied with that. And so, you know, it's my sincere hope, and certainly what we try to practice every day, that we're just being honest and authentic to what we believe in good architecture.
Thank you. I mean, in a way, you're trying to create that next practice now from the kind of role that you've got in legislative bodies, and then the way you've portrayed your practice is that agenda now, which is really encouraging. Simone, the academy.
That's clearly not a very easy question. I would say maybe there are two aspects to it. One is you phrase it as the right student, or how to become the right kind of architect. And maybe one answer is to continue to circle back to what that right means, because that will keep changing, and the answer changes depending on who you ask. So it's having kind of the breadth of knowledge and the humbleness to realize that, you know, what that entails, you never fully know, and you always have to kind of go back and continue to question. And then, of course, in a more general way, and kind of also supporting everything that Tara said, I think it's really about architects that care, I would say, more about people and about what exists already and about the planet than about their own the expression of their own creativity or intentions or ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point that, you know, what next practice looks like is also a kind of ephemeral condition, isn't it? Because tomorrow's next practice might be different to today. Thank you both for the, you know, for the conversation. It's really interesting. I've got a couple of questions, and I'm just going to try and work through those. And one's quite big as well, and is open to both of you. And it's what materials, technologies, or practices are you seeing that are most innovative or exciting? So that could be that there's a particular practice, and, you know, sparing you, Tara, from talking about others, but also like, is there a particular innovation occurring somewhere that's exciting both of you?
Maybe I'll start. I think for me is deconstruction as a practice, both as a practice and as a way to start rethinking about what design means in terms of how it's assembled in the first place, and in terms of what Tara was saying about knowing and surveying and understanding existing buildings. But a practice that I would point to in that sense is rotor and rotor deconstruction, a fantastic practice in Belgium, who have taken an incredibly pragmatic approach to what design is and what architects do, and have mostly looked at reclamation and reuse in that sense, both through their practice, both through kind of creative repurposing, and through discussing with mayors and kind of thinking about policy and legislation, specifications, various types of formats that we use as architects. So I think that's a practice for me that is really innovative and very exciting.
Thank you. That's rotovision. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, Tara.
I was just going to say, I think a process or practice that we're, I think, quite excited about is not actually a traditional architectural practice, but is the idea of generative design and how we use technology to basically better advance how we work, specifically in the space of DFMA, and how we can really maximize the use of offsite construction. The company I'm thinking of at the moment are Test Fits, just because I don't believe there's a UK equivalent of them yet, where one is able to test very quickly different densities on particular sites, but using tech in a really intuitive and sensible way, and how we can translate that to the UK market, how we can translate that to our say space standards and fabric conditions that we're championing. So I think that's what I'll say. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's something I'll look into myself. I wasn't aware of that. Got someone who's not an architect is asking, how can non-architects, if that's everything other than architects, I guess, participate in either creating or lobbying? I mean, it's a difficult territory in architecture to engage and lobby. I mean, do you see increasing roles for non-architects to participate in this agenda, Tara?
I'd say yes, particularly over the last couple of years. I don't think there's ever been a time, certainly in my experience, where we've had so much involvement from communities. So I think at the moment, particularly stakeholder engagement is strong, but lobbying specifically from non-architects and non-professionals, actually, which is critical, but basically users of place, is critical, because they get to experience, we do obviously as well, but they get to experience on a real life basis. I guess the way we approach it is that they tend to be the experts, we're just the professionals. And yes, we have a role to play, but they have an expertise of their place. They know what corners are the dark corners and why they're dark and why no one goes there. So actually, I think there's a real role for non-architects and non-professionals to play here in lobbying, in becoming counselors, in being parts of business improvement districts, in being part of community groups that lobby their local governments, and these can easily be formed today. But I think the more voices we have around the table, particularly when we're pushing for high quality urban realm and high quality development, the better.
Yeah, and there are groups like Civic Square and FAF, which are really driving some of those agendas, which are worth engaging with. So there's a question about how does a practice hold those red lines that it, and you talked about that yourself, Tara. I mean, that's a challenge, isn't it, to hold fast to a position?
It is a challenge, but one I don't think we can afford. This really, it's a paradigm shift. We can't really afford to do any less. And we completely understand, of course, viability, and we've lost clients as a result, particularly when we made the declaration, particularly when we made the transition. We had clients that said, well, this is not what we signed up for. And we completely understand, we're part as friends, but it does mean that the types of clients that we have today are ones who are aligned with these values. And that, I think, hopefully continues to grow. in terms of red lines, I think it's important to think well beyond the red line, because we're in such a connected world, and we have no choice but to. For me personally, I think the real wake-up call was actually when I worked in a planning department, where suddenly red lines didn't exist and our boundaries didn't exist in a physical sense, and we had to think about how places collaborate with each other, with the streets, and with the neighboring local authority. There are no boundaries. So in terms of holding, clients and projects and associations, it's complex, yes, but that's why it's good to talk and bring expertise around the table.
That's great. I mean, that's really admirable, and we need more of that if we want this to become normalized, don't we? And that's really, really, really great to hear. Rather than a question, there is one kind of like provocation. I think it's a really interesting one to just leave out there, and that is about the notion of maintenance. You both talked about that from different positions, and it talks about the fact that in universities, we don't even employ our own maintenance contractors anymore. They're often subcontracted out. But the very idea that there could be a sort of reversal of that condition, and this point refers to a festival of maintenance, is a really interesting idea as a kind of sustainable act. So I'd like to just leave that in the atmosphere as a kind of really interesting everyday action that perhaps we can think about, as maintenance is probably the most sustainable act that we could engage in. That brings us to the end of our time. I mean, it feels like we could carry on for some time. Really interesting positions that you both hold, really interesting conversation. Thank you for participation in the festival, and thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.